Any of us knew about that then. It was very early days, you know.
We were making it up as we went along. I mean, almost everything we did. What Brian did in business, what we did in our social lives, how we handled ourselves, and was all, we did it as we went along. Brian and I would be in the office during the day, and he had the men's company to run. And at night, one would have dinner and then go to the clubs. You couldn't go just anywhere because they'd be mobbed. They were very small, incredibly small. The first one I remember was the ad lib. Then there was the Scotch. Later there was the Cromwellian. And they were very, very exclusive. I mean, you had to be a Rolling Stone or a Beatle or some such person.
It was best to get there around midnight. If you were one of the chosen few, you'd be quickly let inside to play your part in the cast of gossip column Fantasyland. Business rumours abounded in the Scotch. Talk of fiddles and rip-offs and coups against record companies. We learnt just how little Brian Epstein had got from EMI for the Beatles, how a famous manager had been hung from his office window by his feet for chatting up someone else's group. We found out who was on the verge of bankruptcy and who'd given whom the clap. You had to, as a manager, you had to aspire to being what Brian was, to be the manager of the biggest, most enormous success ever in history. And there was a sort of innate jealousy of not being as big as he was, or not having experienced what he had. And therefore, to have dinner with him and get second-hand, at least, from him the experience and all the things you'd ever wanted to ask, I would imagine everybody wanted to ask, except everyone in the country. I mean, they'd either want to ask what it was like being a Beatle or what it was like being a Beatles manager.
Do you ever envy the Beatles?
No, no.
What don't you envy about them, then?
Well, I couldn't do what, obviously, I couldn't do what they do. It's not my job.
A lot of stress has been laid on being gay or fancying John Lennon or somebody else, but I think it was far more just being a loner and suddenly finding he was part of a group. And I think that was much more what he was interested in. And in some way, that brought him into a broader group, again, rather than the Beatles, just show business. But what he wanted was to feel he was one of them, and that's what he could never have. He told me that just once he allowed himself to go and stand at the back with all the girls in a concert in America, I think, at the stadiums. And he screamed, just with the girls and just like one of the girls, which he said is what he'd always wanted to do from the first minute he'd ever seen them. And he spent his whole life being restrained and still wearing suits and ties, and suddenly he just screamed and became the mad fan he wanted to be.
I thought he was a very nice, sweet man. He was very lonely. And he was lonely because he couldn't find a partner. The only partners he could find were the ones that he had to pick up. He had two affairs that I knew of. One was an actor called Michael, and it was absolutely wonderful then. And then he had this lover boy that he picked up in California and brought back from their second tour of America. This was Diz Gillespie. Diz looked a bit like Gene Pitney, clean-cut sort of young man. And as far as I was concerned, it was a nice time because Epstein was playing house.
All the time that I knew him, I don't think that one could ever say that he had any long-term emotional relationship. I mean, I think partly it could have been he wasn't comfortable about the fact that he was gay, and therefore, I suppose, in a way, that led to a situation where you didn't have a successful homosexual relationship and the inability to have one because it was not your ideal way or your underlying way of living your life, or subconsciously, though it may have been. And I don't think that was unusual for the time.
One evening, he wanted me to cook dinner for his mother and father. and he and Diz were there, so I went out and did the usual thing: grapefruit, large Dover soles, veg, and a simple pudding. And we were halfway through the meal when Diz stood up and said something nasty to Epstein and walked out of the flat. Whereupon Queenie and Harry were sitting there dumbfounded, not knowing what to do. Then Epstein left the flat, leaving me and Harry and Queenie there. And they decided to get their coats because there wasn't going to be a complete meal that evening. And as they got ready to leave the flat, Queenie said to me, "Lonnie, look after my son."
Sometimes a man might wanna cry. Sometimes a man might wanna die. He wonders why he's standing all alone. It's 'cause he's got no love to call his own. Sometimes a man feels so
A typical day for me was to get to work at 10, go up to the office. As I passed his bedroom on the way up, there was often notes left for me from under the door, and they could be anything from wake me at 3 o'clock for breakfast, prompt, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They could be some money in an envelope. Please bank my happiness, last night's happiness, because he may have gone to the Claremont or the White Elephant and done some gambling. The downstairs, right downstairs was the staff quarters. This was where his housekeeper and her husband lived. We went up the stairs to the sitting room, and behind the sitting room was Brian's study where he worked. The second floor was his suite of, was the bedroom. You went in through his dressing room, double doors to his dressing room, and then into his bedroom, and then through there to his bathroom. His bathroom was pretty unique. It was totally white, with a huge whole one wall, was El Cordobés on one wall. It was very imposing. And then the rest of the top floor was 2 rooms knocked into one. And that was where I worked, in one corner. It was the office by day and the playroom by night. It was where he had all his memorabilia and his present from Elvis, the Elvis and Kurt Parker had given him. It was just full of treasures of Brian's. It was also where everybody went up at night to play. And at the weekend, I used to put my typewriter under my desk because then it wasn't the office anymore.
I would always see Brian on important occasions, you know, like if it was ever my birthday, he would always show up, you know, and he'd always show up with a gift and take me out to dinner. So when you say, did he change? I don't think so. I think a lot of people may have changed towards him. You know, I mean, let's face it, he had a very difficult life when you think about it. You know, people say, oh, well, he was making all that money, but I mean, there was a lot of pressure involved there. And he, you know, he had a lot of people's, he was in charge of a lot of people.
I would get annoyed with Brian because he spent so much time with the Beatles, more than he did with us. And that was some of my arguments. I'd say, Brian, how come you've gone a week with the Beatles, we haven't seen you, you come one day with me? And he would say, Jerry, please, you realise these 4 guys are the biggest in the world. They're stars. You're a little light bulb. I used to get jealous, but I realised in the end, Brian was correct. He had to spend more time with the Beats.
Here I stand, head in hand, turn my face to the wall.
As time went by, there were so many acts, they could never get the attention that was warranted from Brian. And of course, every act that went to NEMS expected to be treated like the Beatles. And consequently, there was a string of acts that just didn't happen.
Brian was very ambitious for his business, and he wanted to diversify a great deal. Hence his acquisition of the Savile Theatre, which we'd all had high hopes for initially. A number of the artists whom he had then were not very successful either. All these, of course, were counterbalanced by the continuing fantastic success of the Beatles, and Cilla Black and Jerry and the Pacemakers, who continued to be very high earners and very, very popular performers in